Layla Unleashed. Episode 3, Avi's Turn. January 2189. The only consolation for Avi was that because her name was called last, she would be the last to take the test that day. But because Layla was so far from the staircase when the provost made the announcement, Avi was too, and the walk down to the floor below took an extremely long time. The faces of her fellow cadets told different stories as she descended. Her fellow fifth graders were mainly confused. From the looks they shared, and the muttered words they whispered to each other, it was clear that many of them didn't even think someone in their class could be called for a level 2 test. But as she worked her way down, the faces turned from expressions of bewilderment to suspicion to outright frustration as she reached the bottom. 7th and 8th graders didn't like level-ups, the name given to the time's younger students were asked to test above their grade. They so often failed that the experiments felt reckless. Granted, it was only a level 2, but if the young cadet didn't pass, when they didn't pass, the shards would still come hard and fast. There were whispers among the older cadets that level-ups were the provost's attempt to find her chosen one, a cadet whose compression powers were so strong that they'd finally turn the war's tide. But while the occasional level-up went well, and a young cadet eked out a pass, they never blew anybody away. Some 6th graders proved they should be 7th graders, but not the Messiah. Once she reached the floor, Avi took her place at the end of the line. Here was the only place in the tower shielded from the shards. A tall, thick pane of plexiglass reached up perhaps 7 feet and arced gently to match the curve of the wall some ways behind it. The 5 test takers lined up in order, with Avi last, and almost comically smaller than the other 4 cadets. Max was standing in front of her and towering over her. But if he knew who she was, like he mysteriously knew Layla, he wasn't letting on. Once they were in their places, the provost's voice rang out through the tower once more to explain the rules. Everyone had heard them before, so she was brief, but she still hit the main points. The test taker would stand in the circle and wait for the machine to warm up. Once it did, the orb would begin rotating until the 97 shards lifted off and began revolving. When it hit equilibrium, the timer would begin, counting down the 60 seconds until the electromagnet would be deactivated, and this, then, was the moment of truth, when the test taker would either successfully use compression to corral the shards, stopping their outward momentum and letting them fall harmlessly to the floor, or fail, allowing them to spray out into the onlookers. There were also middling results, in which a cadet would manage to catch some, but not all of the shards, or slow their momentum without stopping it. These were still considered failures, but they usually resulted in many fewer injuries. Described differently, passing the test was like stopping a firework from going off after someone had already lit the fuse, using only your mind. And failing was like letting a firework go off in a crowded room. The first cadet to take to the circle was a lanky girl with long dark hair named Violet de la Cruz. If she was nervous, she didn't show it, at least not at first. Looking at her face, Avi saw only a sort of stoic resignation. But then Avi noticed her hands, which were shaking. The moment she entered the circle, the machine began to warm up. A look of panic ripped across Violet's face and Avi heard her say, "Wait, we're starting already? Not yet, please." But the test had begun. Her hands still shaking, Violet grabbed the 2 steel handles perched on shiny pillars stuck in the ground. It was well known that the handles didn't do much. They didn't help you focus your power or anything. But they were helpful in moments like these, when a cadet's nerves threatened to get the best of them and derail the test entirely. On level 2, the machine usually took only 30 seconds or so to warm up. Once it was complete, the orb began to spin, slowly at first and then faster. When it began, the shards looked like they wouldn't do anything at all, so firmly did the magnet hold them to the orb. But then, imperceptibly at first, the shards began to vibrate, and then, slowly, lift off. Captain Marceau always said that the shards looked like angels rising up into the heavens, but whenever he said that, half the class smirked. The shards were no angels. That was happening right now. Once they lifted off, it was hard to predict the shards' movement. They flowed as a group in waves that generally followed the direction of the orb's rotation, but beyond that, each individual shard wandered, seemingly at random. The effect was mesmerizing, and as Avi looked on, she forgot for a moment where she was, as her eyes followed this, then that dancing shard. But her trance broke the moment the great red clock on the opposite wall began its minute-long countdown. When it did, she glanced over at Violet and immediately got nervous. At first, it looked as if Violet would master her shaking hands. She held the metal poles tightly and furrowed her brow as the seconds drained away. Cadets usually tried to control their breathing at this point, and Violet worked hard to make her lungs obey her will. Inhale, 1, 2. Exhale, 1, 2, 3, 4. But as 50 seconds gave way to 40, she faltered and lost her rhythm. Her breath became shallow and quick, and beads of sweat began to appear at her temples. As 30 gave way to 20, the beads formed into streams and began dripping toward her chin. But even as all this was happening, Violet seemed to find herself again. She fixed her gaze on the orb and slowly closed her eyes. As the clock ticked past 10 seconds, her grip on the bars loosened, and she raised herself ever so slightly onto the balls of her feet. 9, 8, 7. Violet's toes curled as if she were trying to get a better grip on the ground beneath her. 6, 5, 4. And then, suddenly, it was as if every muscle in her body tensed at the same time as she called upon her powers. 3, 2, 1. 0. A giant chunk sound boomed out from beneath the ground as the operators pulled back power from the electromagnet. To cadets who weren't quite so familiar with the machine's function, this moment was always deceptive because the sound preceded the demagnetization by a few seconds. In other words, it seemed like every cadet was going to pass at first. And this is exactly what happened to Violet. When the sound echoed forth, hope flashed across the faces of many of the younger cadets as the shards held. But that hope was short-lived. It wasn't even close. The second the magnet shut down, the shards went hurtling out into the tower. Avi heard the solid thuds of rubberized metal hitting plastic around and above her, and it was clear that more than a few cadets had been hit. She immediately found Layla near the top and was relieved to see her giving a heartening wave. Other cadets weren't so lucky. More than a few were doubled over, having been hit in the torso. Still others were rubbing legs and arms painfully, and though most of these had only been grazed by shards, even these wounds would take weeks to heal. Most unfortunate of all was an 8th grader who had clearly taken a shard near straight in the forehead at close range. She lay flat on her back, and emergency techs were already rushing over with a stretcher to whisk her away to the infirmary. It took Avi a minute or two to return her gaze to the circle. Initially, she didn't see Violet anywhere and worried that perhaps she had bolted. But then she found her, crumpled against the low wall to the left of the poles. Her body shook with sobs that were fueled by frustration, exhaustion, and shame. It didn't take long for 2 attendants to file into the circle, lift her by the shoulders, and escort her out of the building. It was a disheartening start to the session. The 2nd cadet, a tall boy with red hair and freckles who couldn't have weighed more than 70 pounds, and whose name Avi couldn't recall, fared a little better than Violet, but not much. When the clock hit 0 and the magnet shut down, he maintained control of the swirling shards for a half-second, but lost contain quickly. That put some arc on the shards as they looped outward, and the light bend in their trajectories gave most of the cadets time to dodge. One precocious 7th grader even had the audacity to try to catch a shard heading her way, but she missed. The cadets next to her frowned. It was bad luck to touch them. The 3rd cadet was another clear fail, and by the time attendants ushered out the half-dozen or so injured, the crowd was noticeably more jittery than at the beginning of the session. The test was hard, but few could remember 3 fails in a row, and it was starting to feel like a bad omen, especially for Max Yellen, who was up next. But if Max was feeling unlucky, he didn't look it. He strode calmly to the circle and rested his hands lightly on top of the metal handles. He immediately closed his eyes and waited in silence for the hum of the machine to begin. If he was confident, he had a right to be. In his 5th grade year, he nearly passed the test on his first try, which few 5th graders ever did, and managed the shards easily on his 2nd. And while this was his first attempt at level 2, he looked at ease in the circle. When the countdown began, Max kept his body still and his breathing steady. When the clock hit 0 and the loud chunk signaled demagnetization, he stayed entirely still. All the cadets from floor to ceiling braced for impact and hunched down to make their bodies small targets. They didn't have to. Those looking closely saw the merest twitch at Max's temple as the magnet shut down and his compression powers took over. As that happened, the shards pulsed outward an inch or so before they began bumping into each other and slowing down. The more they collided, the slower they went, and after a few seconds, one by one, they began falling harmlessly to the floor. It was beautiful and, for the cadets, a huge relief. Max had done it. A moment later, the rest of the shards came crashing to the floor beneath the orb in a big, gorgeous clatter. The cadets erupted into cheers that were nearly as loud. Max betrayed no emotion as he walked from the circle, keeping an impassive look on his face. Layla noticed, however, that he walked back to the line a little more slowly than before. It was clear that the success had taken something out of him. As he passed Avi, he raised his head ever so slightly and nodded at her. The cheers for Max faded rapidly, however, as Avi made her way to the circle. As she did, She saw lots of her fellow cadets again grumbling or shaking their heads. One said, "This is insane," a bit too loudly so all the rest could hear. Avi was happy Max had gone just before her. It was helpful to see someone else pass easily. Obviously, it was possible. In her best training sessions, she had felt something similar, that compression wasn't so much about physical exertion, about a tensing of muscles. It drew on a different, more mysterious set of faculties. When she was able to harness the power, pulling it up from the ground beneath, she wasn't using mind or body, she thought, but something different, something distinct. Arriving in the circle, however, stopped her daydreaming. As she looked around, she heard snickers coming from the rings of cadets. The reason was clear. Avi was so short she could barely see over the protective wall, and grabbing the poles was an awkward reach. The attendants quickly noticed the problem and rushed over to an unassuming door behind one of the staircases, emerging with a low wooden crate. Avi had to take the test on a stool, it seemed. Layla was embarrassed for her. But Avi didn't look embarrassed. Instead, she looked determined. She held up her hand for a moment, glancing toward the observation box, turned around, and sat down on the crate. Slowly, as the crowd muttered and grew restless, she removed her socks and shoes. She then picked up the crate and handed it back to one of the attendants before stepping into the circle. Though she could see only part of the orb in front of her, she knew instinctually that compression had little to do with seeing. Like Max before her, as the machine warmed up, she closed her eyes. Once more, the growing hum of the machine. Once more, the quickening turn of the orb. Once more, the slow elevation of the shards to the stable orbit a few inches above the shiny metal. And once more, the countdown. But what followed was nothing like anyone, cadet or faculty, had seen in the past. Looking on from high above, Layla had an unimpeded view. Though from that angle it was hard to see Avi, Layla had a clear view of the orb and the revolving shards. As the numbers on the clock ticked down, Layla could swear that she saw the shards move closer to the orb, crowding a bit nearer to it, as if huddling for warmth. And the moment the magnet powered down, there were audible gasps. Immediately, each and every one of the 97 hunks of metal stopped in midair, frozen as if fixed in space. There they hung for perhaps 10 whole seconds. But then, one by one, slowly first, but with increasing speed, each shard plunged into the surface of the metal below, punching 97 clean holes into the orb and sticking there like darts in a board. When it was all over, the orb looked like a demented flower shorn of its petals. The crowd looked on, mouths agape, in total silence. Layla, stunned, peered back over the railing, only to see Avi fallen to the floor, her head and one arm protruding awkwardly from the entrance to the circle. Her eyes were closed, and she wasn't moving. Here ends episode 3 of Layla Unleashed. If you'd like to support us, subscribe to our Patreon at patreon.com/Layla Unleashed, or even become a member. Check back soon for episode 4, wherever you get your podcasts. Good night.